was the real CEO? Who was really making the decisions while Jack was finding himself? Donald Trump knew early. He always did. The New York Post knew. They had his number. In May of 2020, Yoel Roth was the CEO. Take a look at this.
Here's one. This is the arbiter. This guy is the arbiter of what's supposed to go on Twitter. He's the one he thought, and he used CNN as a guide. CNN, which is fake news. He uses CNN as a guide. His name is Yoel Roth, and he's the one that said that mail-in balloting, you look mail-in. No fraud? No fraud? Really? Why don't you take a look all over the country? There's cases all over the country. If we went to mail-in balloting, our election all over the world would look as a total joke. It would be a total joke. There's such fraud and abuse, and you know about harvesting, where they harvest the ballots and they go and grab them and they go to people's houses and they say, sign here. No, it doesn't work out. Now, an absentee ballot, you can't be there or you're sick, and you go and you register and you do all sorts of things to get that ballot, and there's good security measures. But where they send out, like in California, millions and millions of ballots to anybody that's breathing. Anybody in California that's breathing gets a ballot.
But, Mr. President, that's not true.
So here, excuse me, wait a minute, I'm not finished. So here's your man, and that's on Twitter.
Yeah, that was from May 2020. And look at that front page. Look at those nutty tweets that this head of censorship at Twitter, head of trust and safety, was writing. Yes, let me read one of his tweets. Yes, that person in the pink hat is clearly a bigger threat to your brand of feminism than actual Nazis in the White House. Oh, were there actual Nazis in the White House? Like who? Ivanka Trump or Jared Kushner? So who is this Yoel Roth, who Donald Trump knew was the problem back in May of 2020? He's the head of trust and safety. I love that. That's straight out of Orwell's 1984. So to become the boss of censorship at Twitter, what's your background? Are you an expert in the American First Amendment? That's what they call their guarantee of freedom of speech. Is he a legal expert? Well, he does have a PhD, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. But here he is explaining why he made the decision to deplatform the sitting president of the United States, not the head of Iran or Russia or Venezuela. They've never been deplatformed, but why he took down the president of the United States. Here's Yoel Roth saying how terrified he was, how it was about his trauma, his own trauma.
But what are you worried about these Twitter files coming out? And what was that experience like, having Kellyanne, who's always in control of herself, sicking this MAGA trolls on you?
It's terrifying. I thought I was going to be a college professor for a living. Mm-hmm. I got a PhD and was doing research that nobody cared about, and then I was like, oh, this platform thing is cool. Like, I can go and do research there, and mm-hmm. then one thing led to another, and all of a sudden we apply a misinformation label to Donald Trump's account, and I'm on the cover of the New York Post, mm-hmm. and that is a deeply terrifying experience. And I say this from a position of unquestioned privilege as a cis white male. Like, the internet is much scarier and much worse for lots of other people who aren't me, but it was pretty fucking scary for a long time.
What was the
as a result
part?
of that? When you get targeted in some of these ways, it's hard to differentiate between what is somebody just online trying to rattle you and what's a real threat. You see in things like Pizzagate that online conspiracies can mobilize very real and very direct offline violence. And I worry about that. I had been doxxed years before by teenagers, actually. They're always behind it. But, I saw those harms, I experienced those harms, and now it was those harms through a mainstream news outlet being held up in the Oval Office by the former president of the United States, and that is deeply terrifying.
He's the kind of guy who talks about trauma online, experienced those harms. I found the New York Post and Donald Trump deeply terrifying. He's the kind of guy who talks about microaggressions. So obviously he had to use Twitter and his powers for his own therapy. Take a look at this video.
Donald Trump,
That one I don't think was a mistake.
January 6th.
So it starts on the 6th, but it also starts prior to that.
That's correct.
In the weeks leading up, in the weeks between Election Day and January 6th, Twitter moderated hundreds. I think the final number ended up was like 140 separate tweets from just at Real Donald Trump that violated various policies.
Yes, he was
including
good
the
at that.
integrity policy.
Yeah.
Every morning it was a new tweet. Much of it was recirculating some of the same narratives, and all of it was focused on the ultimately false claim that the 2020 election had been stolen. And so we're going into the events of the 6th, and there's that context. There's the centrality of his account in
So you let him get away with it for a long time, in other words.
Well, we'd been enforcing on it, right? So we restricted the tweets. We put warnings on them. You couldn't like them. You couldn't retweet them. But we didn't ban him because it was a relevant part of a moment in American politics.
Right.
The events of the 6th happen. And if you talk to content moderators who worked on January 6th, myself included, the word that nearly everybody uses is trauma. We experienced those events, not some of us as Americans, but not just as Americans or as citizens, but as people working on sort of how to prevent harm on the internet. We saw the clearest possible example of what it looked like for things to move from online to off. We saw we saw the way that rhetoric about a stolen election was being mobilized on sites like the Donald.win.
Sure.
We saw the trafficking of this content in the fringe parts of the internet, and we saw people dead in the Capitol.
Well, hang on just one second. Why can't you dispute whether an election was fair? I mean, are Venezuelans or Russians or Iranians or Cubans allowed to dispute it? Of course they are. They should. Are we not allowed to talk about that? Isn't that part of freedom of speech? You can talk about whatever you want to talk about. I mean, Democrats dispute elections by Republicans all the time. They never, in fact, accepted George W. Bush saying he stole the election from Al Gore. That's an excerpt from my show every night. It's called the Ezra Levant Show. That's me, Ezra Levant. You can see the whole thing behind our paywall. Well, there's a lot of goodies behind there. I do a show every weeknight. My friends Sheila Gunn Reid and David Menzies and Nat and Kat have their shows too. You get a ton of content for just $8 a month. There's so much in there you won't find anywhere else. Go to rebelnewsplus.com.